Welcome to this lecture on spatial data analysis. Some very rudimentary methods that are used in GIS, specifically spatial methods. This lecture will finish off with an introduction to an exercise in topographic analysis, hydrological analysis, using the D8 method. But before we get there, let's look at some different spatial analyses that we can do with both raster and vector data. First thing we're going to look at is, or the concepts that we need to work out, first of all, topography and topology. These words are very similar, but they mean two different things. And generally speaking, we can associate them with raster or vector. Topography, generally speaking, we represent in raster, the DEM, digital elevation model. And topology really does require us to have vector data instead. The relationship between objects, because we need objects for there to be relationships between, relationships such as touching and crossing, something being within or outside of another object. So let's move on to looking at these individually. Let's start with topography. And we can actually apply these concepts to other types of continuous data as well in our analyses. But for now, let's just stick to topography as in elevation, height above sea level. But where we have continuous data, we can think of similar concepts that apply even to these as well. But as I said, let's just look at the elevation data now. So we have areas that are high and areas that are low, and then there's concepts of the slope. We can see that the slope is different here to there. Put some numbers on it perhaps. Slope 45 degrees or 30 degrees. Elevation ranges between 10 and 100 meters. Very basic concept. This is topography, where we are in terms of elevation in the landscape. And we can break this down, analyze our topography even further. If we begin here with our digital elevation model, the height above sea level, we have this, our actual elevation as it were, and we've rasterized it, we've put it into our raster. So each cell picks up a value for the elevation at this point. This illustration actually shows us one of those interesting points about discrete and continuous data, where we're saying raster is very good at representing continuous data, but actually when we zoom in, as it were, to the close level of the actual cell size, we can see that they are discrete homogeneous packages, but we are saying that this is continuous data because we step back far enough and we can see that, and it appears to be continuous. But we have our elevation there, and then we can analyze this to see how steep the slope is between the different pixels. So going from one pixel, or one cell rather, to another, we have a particular slope, which is just the distance between the centers or the edges of the cells, it doesn't matter, and the elevation change. That gives us the slope. And then we can analyze this slope further and say, which way is that slope pointing? Which this is sloping towards that direction, and this is sloping down towards that direction. And we can extend this again into so that we have 360 degrees rather than just left and right here, and we get the concept of aspect. So we can be north facing, south facing, east or west facing, for example. We can go even farther from the slope, analyze this further, and we can get the curvature, or how rapidly the change is occurring. Not particularly well illustrated down here, but there's the rate of change of the slope. It would be our curvature. We can also analyze curvature in the other direction, going around a hill, as it were, as well, to see how quickly the slope changes in that direction. Now that's curvature. And then hillshade. Given the failure of my curvature illustration, I'm not even bothered at all with illustrating hillshade. It's a much more difficult concept to illustrate figuratively like this. It's much better to just look at a hillshade model. What we're doing is we're shining a lamp over our elevation model, and the features in the elevation model cast shadows. And typically for a hillshade, the lamp, as it were, is placed in the top left corner, like a desk lamp, so that our eyes, our brains, which are trained to place the lamp there in that position for some reason, accept the illumination of the landscape, so that up in the landscape features that are higher look higher to our minds. For some reason, this just psychologically seems to aid our understanding. So let's illustrate these different concepts that we've looked at. We'll start by looking at something that absolutely isn't elevation. This is our aerial photograph over a part of the western part of Gävle. Here we have Gävleån running through here, big river, and then we have Kungsbäcken here, another small river, and we can see a motorway and some fields and some trees, forests, houses. So an aerial photograph. But let's move on to the DEM. So here's our digital elevation model, where the lighter areas are higher in elevation, and all of a sudden a new feature turns up. The picture is suddenly dominated by this. This is an esker running along essentially the bottom of a valley. There's not much of a valley in this area, but we can also see that this river is running parallel to it. They both, as this is a subglacial feature, a drainage feature, the water running under the glacier when there was ice here sought a low point in the topography, as does the modern river, although partially this is constrained by the presence of the esker as well. But when we look at the elevation data, we can see some hillocky moraine features up here. We have the river running through here, and the elevation is reasonably constant, and then there's a sudden drop here. There's a dam here stopping the water flow, natural water flow, and then there's a sudden drop in elevation. We can even see the much smaller river here becomes perhaps even more distinct in the elevation model, as well as the motorway with some strange holes in it because of our elevation model always representing the lowest possible elevation in the terrain. So bridges, which these overpasses are then removed. So we always have the lowest features in the landscape. If we then look at the slope, how rapidly the elevation changes, we can say, we can see that now the major river, the Gävleån here, becomes more prominent because we have these rapid changes in elevation. The amount of change in elevation may not be as great. This may be only a couple of meters, a few meters, but that change occurs over a very short distance, and therefore we have a much steeper slope. So here we have a higher gradient, a steeper slope. Whereas elsewhere things tend to be reasonably flat or change elevation quite slowly, so that we don't get these distinct lines. So this is slope. And we can see how the steep banks of the river match up here on the aerial photograph. So that's connecting slope back to features that we can see in the aerial photograph. If we then go on to aspect. Aspect is the direction in which the slope is facing. And all of a sudden now, in this image, we have lots of things happening. There's noise everywhere, as it were, or information everywhere, rather, not actually noise. And we can see changes in aspect all over the image. But let's remember that this is not the amount of slope. This isn't this doesn't represent the steepness of the slope. This is just the direction. It can be a very, very shallow slope, barely perceptible, but it has a direction, and that direction is represented in this image. So we can see a lot of changes in information, changes in the direction of the slope, even those that may not be terribly obvious to us. If we were to compare this to the aerial photograph, we can see that these fields here are quite flat. And when walking around here, we perhaps wouldn't regard them as having much of a change in slope direction at all. But the aspect data says otherwise. It says that there are changes here. So there's some information here that's could be quite useful that we couldn't see either in the aerial photograph or in the original DEM. It wasn't terribly obvious in that data either. Not until we did this, we created this derivative product to find out the changes in the slope direction aspect. So this could be useful for example, if you want to work out your southern exposure, if you want to grow or create a garden somewhere, which part is south-facing, which land is, which field has a greater proportion of south-facing parts to it, hopefully then increasing its exposure to sunlight and warming the land more. These could be important qualities for you when making assessments on, say, the quality of a property or the productivity of the land. If we combine certain aspects of the previous analyses, we get the hillshade, this illumination from, in this case, from the top left. Our lamp is up here, illuminating the landscape, and we can see here that this sort of south-facing bank of the river is in shadow because our illumination is from up here, and we can see features. Things start to stand out more distinctly. This makes a little more sense than the aspect image that we looked at. There's less not noise, but the small changes aren't emphasized, but rather the large scale changes are there. It seems as if we can see more details, which is one of the main uses of the hillshade. It helps us to understand the other data that we are seeing. So quite often the hillshade will be transparent and draped over other material to lift the details in it. For example, just a coloured a coloured DEM, where the elevation is presented as colour, from perhaps blues through greens to browns and then whites, and then we overlay that with the hillshade, and more detail comes out from the elevation data. This is difficult to numerically analyze in this form like this, but certainly we can examine the image and look for details. And I think something that's quite interesting, at least if you're a geographer, if we look along this esker, we can see these features here. This is high elevations, but we get these bands going around here, and I suspect that those might be raised beaches from when this area was inundated. As the ice melted and retreated, we had this whole area was covered in water, and then as the water retreated, sank down, waves came into this area and created these beaches. Not very strong features. The waves were perhaps not very strong, weren't there for very long, but we got these raised beaches here. I suspect that's what they are. I could be wrong, but looking at this now, that's what they would look like. So that's just one thing we can identify using the hillshade. This is another hillshade. Simply the settings for this have been adjusted to match solar noon approximately in this area for midsummer, so the center of the solar year. Maximum illumination, we could say. Potential illumination, and we can perform several of these hillshades and perhaps sum them up, and then try to calculate a potential illumination in the different areas of this region to see which are best for agriculture, for example, or growing. Or if you want to put a ski slope somewhere, where do we have the least amount of sunshine so that the snow lasts longest? That's also another one. Just we can analyze the exposure to sunlight potentially using the hillshades for this.